The snow fell heavy across Miller County that December, blanketing the rolling hills of Missouri in a silence that seemed to swallow sound itself. Sarah Mitchell pressed her face against the cold window of the Greyhound bus, watching familiar farmhouses drift past like ghosts from her childhood. She hadn't been home to Millerville in 3 years, not since she left for her marketing job in Chicago, chasing dreams that now felt as distant as the stars above the frozen wheat fields. The bus wheezed to a stop at Murphy's General Store, the same weathered building where she used to buy penny candy with coins her grandfather slipped into her small hands. Christmas Eve had arrived with a kind of bitter cold that made your breath form crystals in the air, and Sarah pulled her city coat tighter around her shoulders. Something deep in her chest ached with anticipation and regret as she stepped onto the cracked pavement of her hometown. The walk to Grandpa Joe's farmhouse stretched longer than she remembered, her designer boots slipping on patches of ice that locals would have navigated with ease. Main Street looked smaller somehow, with half the storefronts boarded up and Christmas decorations that had seen better decades hanging from rusty lampposts. Mrs. Henderson's bakery still glowed warm in the gathering dusk, and the smell of fresh bread drifted through the winter air like a memory made real. Sarah quickened her pace, guilt gnawing at her stomach as she thought about the unanswered phone calls, the birthday cards she'd forgotten to send, the promises to visit that had dissolved into the busy blur of city life. The old Methodist church bells chimed 7 o'clock, their bronze voices carrying across the valley the same way they had when she was 8 years old and believed Christmas magic could fix anything. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the familiar silhouette of the 2-story farmhouse came into view, smoke rising from the chimney like a prayer against the star-studded sky. The front porch light flickered on as if sensing her approach, casting long shadows across the snow-covered yard where she once built snowmen with her sister Emma before the cancer took her away 5 winters ago. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she climbed the wooden steps that creaked under her weight, the same steps where Grandpa Joe had taught her to tie her shoes and where they'd shared countless summer evenings watching fireflies dance above the cornfield. Through the frost-kissed window, she could see him sitting alone by the fireplace, his weathered hands holding a simple piece of bread, his shoulders bent with the weight of years and solitude. The sight hit her like a physical blow, this image of the strongest man she'd ever known reduced to such quiet loneliness on Christmas Eve. She raised her hand to knock but hesitated, suddenly afraid of what she might find behind that familiar door, afraid of how much had changed, afraid of how much she had let slip away. In that moment, with snow falling around her like confetti from heaven, Sarah realized she was about to discover whether love could truly bridge the distance created by time, ambition, and the cruel geography of grown-up life. Sarah's knuckles barely grazed the wooden door before it swung open, as if Grandpa Joe had been waiting by the window all along. His eyes, still sharp despite his 82 years, widened with surprise and something deeper, a joy so pure it made her chest tighten with emotion. The years had carved deeper lines around his eyes and bent his tall frame slightly forward, but his smile remained unchanged, that same warm expression that had greeted her scraped knees and broken hearts throughout her childhood. "Sarah girl," he whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. "I can't believe you're here." She dropped her suitcase and fell into his arms, inhaling the familiar scent of Old Spice and wood smoke that had always meant safety and unconditional love. His embrace felt friendlier than she remembered, his bones more prominent beneath his flannel shirt, but his hold on her was still strong enough to make her feel like that little girl who believed her grandfather could move mountains. The farmhouse hadn't changed much, though dust motes danced in corners that once sparkled under Grandma Rose's meticulous care. The same faded quilt lay draped over the couch where Sarah had spent countless sick days, and the mantelpiece still displayed school photos of her and Emma, frozen smiles from decades past. But something felt different. Emptier somehow, as if the house itself was holding its breath in loneliness. The Christmas tree stood in its usual corner, smaller than the grand Douglas firs of her memory, decorated with ornaments she recognized from childhood. The paper angel Emma made in 2nd grade, the wooden reindeer Joe had carved himself, the string of cranberries that had somehow survived 40 years of holiday seasons. No presents waited beneath its branches, and Sarah's heart squeezed tight as she realized how truly alone he'd been spending his holidays. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with family photographs that seemed to watch her with familiar eyes. "I was just having some supper," Joe said, gesturing toward the simple wooden table where a single plate held a piece of buttered bread and a cup of coffee gone cold. Sarah's stomach clenched at the sparse meal, remembering Christmas Eves when this same table groaned under the weight of Grandma Rose's feast. Honey-glazed ham, cornbread stuffing, green bean casserole, and apple pie that made the whole house smell like cinnamon and love. The contrast between then and now felt like a punch to her gut, highlighting every phone call she'd skipped, every holiday she'd spent networking with colleagues instead of nurturing the relationships that truly mattered. "I wasn't expecting company," he continued with a self-conscious chuckle, brushing crumbs from his weathered hands. She watched him move around the kitchen with careful, deliberate steps, reaching for another plate with movements that suggested he rarely had reason to set two places anymore. The sight of his solitary Christmas Eve dinner, just bread and coffee, would haunt her for years to come. "Grandpa, why didn't you tell me things were?" Sarah began, then stopped, not sure how to finish the sentence without revealing the depth of her guilt. He paused in his movements, his back still turned to her, and she saw his shoulders sag slightly as if her unfinished question had touched something tender and raw. When he finally faced her, his eyes held a mixture of pride and pain that made her want to disappear into the floorboards. "Didn't want to worry you, honey," he said simply, as if his suffering was a burden he shouldn't share with the granddaughter who'd built a life 300 miles away. "You got your own life up there in Chicago, your fancy job and all those important people depending on you." His words carried no accusation, only a quiet acceptance that made Sarah feel smaller than any argument could have. She realized then that love sometimes meant staying silent about your own needs to protect someone else's dreams, even when that silence slowly broke your heart. The kitchen felt cavernous despite its modest size, filled with the echoes of conversations that should have happened and didn't. Sarah watched her grandfather move with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to solitude, heating leftover soup that had probably been his lunch as well as his planned dinner. The refrigerator hummed in the corner, decorated with grocery store coupons and church bulletins, practical items that spoke of a life stripped down to its bare essentials. She noticed the pill organizer on the counter, compartments labeled with days of the week, some still full despite it being Saturday evening. "Have you been taking your medication, Grandpa?" she asked gently, already knowing the answer from his slight hesitation before nodding. The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken truths. Doctor visits attended alone, prescriptions that cost too much, health scares that had no one to share them with. Sarah realized she'd been so busy building her professional life that she'd forgotten to tend the foundation it was built on. As they sat down to their simple meal together, the years seemed to telescope backward and forward simultaneously. Joe asked about her job, her apartment, her life in the city, listening with the same intense attention he'd given her childhood stories about school friends and playground adventures. Sarah found herself editing her responses, leaving out the late nights at the office that had become her norm, the relationships that had withered under the pressure of her ambition, the growing sense that success felt remarkably like loneliness when you had no one to share it with. Instead, she told him about the buildings she could see from her apartment window, the museums she'd visited, the restaurants that served food from countries they'd only seen in National Geographic magazines. But even as she spoke, her eyes kept drifting to the empty chair where Grandma Rose used to sit, where her parents had shared countless meals before the car accident took them when Sarah was 16. The ghosts of Christmas past seemed to gather around the table, reminding her of all the love that had been and all the time that couldn't be recovered. The conversation flowed easier as the evening progressed, falling into rhythms as familiar as breathing despite the years that had passed between them. Joe told her about the neighbors who still checked on him occasionally, the church ladies who brought casseroles after Sunday service, the young pastor who'd replaced Reverend Matthews and was trying to breathe new life into the dwindling congregation. Sarah listened to stories about mild town gossip, crop yields, and weather patterns, realizing how much she'd missed the simple cadence of rural conversation, the way problems were shared and solutions found through community rather than isolation. When Joe mentioned that the Hendersons were thinking of closing the bakery because their son had moved to Kansas City for work, Sarah felt something twist in her chest. The fabric of this small town was unraveling thread by thread, and she'd been too distant to notice or care. "Things change," Joe said philosophically, stirring his coffee with a spoon that had seen decades of use. "People grow up, move on, find their own paths. That's the way it's supposed to be." But Sarah heard the loneliness beneath his acceptance, the quiet grief of a man watching his world slowly disappear one empty chair at a time. As the evening wore on, Joe shared more stories about the changes that had swept through Millerville like a slow-motion tornado. The school had consolidated with 3 other districts, busing children 40 minutes away to buildings that felt nothing like the one-room schoolhouse where Sarah and Emma had learned to read. The post office had closed, forcing residents to drive to the county seat for services that had once been within walking distance. Young families continued to migrate toward cities where jobs existed and futures seemed possible, leaving behind elderly residents who watched their community slowly empty like a leaking bucket. "It's not anyone's fault," Joe said with a philosophical acceptance that seemed to characterize his approach to life's disappointments. "Progress moves forward whether we're ready or not. The trick is figuring out what's worth holding on to when everything else is changing." Sarah wondered what he'd chosen to preserve in his own life, what treasures he'd protected against the erosion of time and circumstance. Looking around the room at family photographs and handmade quilts, at books worn soft from reading and furniture built to last generations, she began to understand that love itself was what he'd been safeguarding all these years. The next morning, Sarah woke to the smell of bacon frying and coffee percolating, scents that transported her instantly back to childhood Christmas mornings when the whole house would buzz with activity and anticipation. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains Grandma Rose had hung decades ago, casting intricate patterns across the hardwood floors that creaked familiarly under Sarah's feet as she made her way downstairs. Joe stood at the stove wearing the same apron he'd inherited from his wife, carefully tending to eggs and bacon in cast-iron pans that had fed 3 generations of the Mitchell family. The kitchen felt warmer and more alive than it had the night before, as if her presence had awakened something in the house that had been dormant too long. "Merry Christmas, honey," he called over his shoulder, his voice carrying genuine joy that made Sarah's heart swell with emotion she hadn't felt in years. The simple act of waking up to someone else making breakfast reminded her of all the small kindnesses she'd forgotten existed, all the ways love manifested in daily gestures rather than grand proclamations. Outside the kitchen window, the world sparkled under a fresh coating of snow that had fallen during the night, transforming the familiar landscape into something magical and pristine. The old red barn stood like a Christmas card scene against the white field, its weathered boards and crooked door somehow more beautiful for their imperfections. Sarah could see deer tracks crisscrossing the yard, evidence of wildlife that had found sanctuary on the farmland that Joe no longer actively worked but still maintained as a habitat for creatures that had nowhere else to go. The sight of rabbits hopping between the bare rose bushes made her smile, remembering how Emma used to name every animal they spotted and create elaborate stories about their secret lives. "The Hendersons are coming by later," Joe announced, setting a plate of eggs, bacon, and toast in front of her with the satisfaction of someone who rarely had occasion to cook for company. Mildred insisted on bringing Christmas dinner, said she'd made too much for just her and Harold anyway. Sarah recognized the gentle fiction of small-town kindness, the way people looked after each other without making it seem like charity or pity. The breakfast tasted better than any restaurant meal Sarah had enjoyed in Chicago, flavored with simplicity and the kind of attention that came from someone who viewed cooking as an act of love rather than a chore to be completed efficiently. Joe ate slowly, savoring each bite while asking about her flight, her apartment, her plans for the rest of the holiday weekend. Sarah found herself reluctant to mention that she'd originally planned to fly back to Chicago on the 26th, that she'd scheduled this visit as a brief obligation rather than a genuine reunion. The thought of leaving so soon seemed impossible now, like walking away from a warm fire into a blizzard. "How long has it been since you had a real Christmas?" she asked, immediately regretting the question when she saw a flicker of pain cross his weathered features. The answer was written in the sparse decorations, the single place setting from the night before, the absence of wrapped gifts under the small tree. 3 years, she realized. Not since Emma's final Christmas, when the whole extended family had gathered for what they all knew would be their last celebration together. After breakfast, they worked together to make the house more festive, a project that revealed both Joe's careful preservation of family traditions and his adaptation to solitary life. From the basement, they retrieved boxes of Christmas decorations that Sarah remembered from childhood. Handmade ornaments crafted over decades, strings of lights that had somehow survived multiple moves and renovations, stockings embroidered with names of family members both living and gone. Emma's stocking still hung in its familiar spot, and Sarah's breath caught as she saw it had been filled with small items. A chocolate bar, some peppermints, a packet of wildflower seeds, and a folded piece of paper that she didn't have the courage to examine. "I still put out her stocking every year," Joe said simply, not offering any explanation beyond the obvious truth that love doesn't recognize the boundaries between life and death. Sarah understood that grief had its own logic, its own requirements for maintaining connection with those who'd moved beyond physical presence. The ritual of preparing Emma's stocking had probably become as essential to Joe's Christmas as attending midnight service or watching the sun rise over snow-covered fields. They spent the morning transforming the farmhouse into something closer to the magical place Sarah remembered from childhood, hanging garland on the mantelpiece and positioning nativity figures that had witnessed decades of Christmas stories. Joe moved more slowly than Sarah remembered, pausing occasionally to catch his breath or steady himself against furniture, reminders that time had been working its inevitable changes even during her absence. But his enthusiasm for the decorating process remained infectious, and Sarah found herself laughing as they debated the proper placement of ornaments and untangled strings of lights that had somehow knotted themselves during storage. The house responded to their efforts like a sleepy person waking up, rooms becoming brighter and more welcoming as familiar objects returned to their seasonal positions. By noon, the farmhouse looked ready for the kind of Christmas celebration that had made Sarah's childhood magical, complete with flickering candles and the scent of pine boughs Joe had cut from trees on the back 40. The Hendersons arrived promptly at 1 o'clock, their arms loaded with covered dishes and their faces glowing with the pleasure of people who genuinely enjoyed spreading holiday cheer. Mildred Henderson had been Grandma Rose's closest friend, and seeing her bustling around the kitchen with practiced efficiency brought back memories of church potlucks and community gatherings where everyone contributed what they could and no one left hungry. Harold Henderson moved more carefully, his recent hip surgery evident in his deliberate steps, but his smile remained as warm as ever as he settled into conversation with Joe about weather patterns and the prospects for next year's growing season. Sarah watched these interactions with new appreciation, understanding now that they represented more than casual friendships. They were lifelines, connections that made survival possible in a world that had grown increasingly isolated and impersonal. The Hendersons hadn't just come to share a meal. They'd come to weave another thread in the social fabric that kept small communities from completely unraveling. The Christmas dinner they shared that afternoon possessed a richness that went far beyond the perfectly prepared food covering the table. Mildred had brought honey-glazed ham, cornbread dressing, sweet potato casserole, green beans with almonds, and a pecan pie that looked like it belonged in a magazine photograph. But more than the feast itself, Sarah treasured the conversation that flowed around the table. Stories about neighbors, updates on children and grandchildren scattered across the country, gentle gossip about local politics and church affairs. These people knew each other's histories, had witnessed each other's joys and sorrows, had created a community based on genuine care rather than convenience or professional networking. Sarah realized she couldn't name a single person in Chicago who would notice if she disappeared for a week, much less show up at her door with a home-cooked meal and several hours of genuine companionship. The contrast between urban anonymity and rural interdependence struck her with unexpected force, making her question assumptions about progress and success that had guided her choices for the past several years. As the Hendersons prepared to leave, Mildred pulled Sarah aside with a conspiratorial air of someone sharing important intelligence. Her weathered hands gripped Sarah's arm with surprising strength, and her eyes held a mixture of concern and determination that suggested this conversation had been planned rather than spontaneous. "Your grandfather hasn't been himself lately," she whispered, glancing toward the living room where Joe and Harold discussed the merits of different snow tire brands. "He's been forgetting things, small things mostly, but Harold found him at the grocery store last week looking confused, couldn't remember what he'd come to buy." Sarah's stomach dropped as she absorbed this information, puzzle pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. The pills she'd noticed on the counter, some containers still full despite the advancing week, the sparse meals, the general air of someone struggling to maintain routines that had once been automatic. Suddenly everything made horrible sense. "Has he seen a doctor?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer from Mildred's expression. The nearest medical facility was 30 miles away, and Joe had never been comfortable asking for help, especially when it involved admitting vulnerability or weakness. "He's missed 2 appointments that I know of," Mildred continued, her voice heavy with the frustration of someone who cared deeply but had limited influence. "Says the roads are too icy or his truck's acting up. Always some excuse that sounds reasonable until you add them all together." Sarah realized her grandfather had been performing competence for her benefit the night before, summoning energy and focus for their reunion while hiding the daily struggles that had become his new reality. The thought of him navigating confusion alone, trying to maintain his independence while his mind occasionally betrayed him, made her feel sick with guilt and terror. "Dr. Martinez at the clinic has been asking Harold about him, wondering if someone in the family might encourage Joe to come in for a proper evaluation," Mildred added, her meaning clear even without explicit words. The medical community was concerned, the neighbors were worried, and Sarah had been 300 miles away, oblivious to warning signs that should have prompted immediate action. "He's proud, doesn't want to be a burden on anyone, but pride can be dangerous when it keeps you from getting help you need." After the Hendersons left, Sarah watched her grandfather more carefully, noting small signs she'd missed during the emotional reunion of the previous evening. He struggled momentarily to remember where he'd put his reading glasses, searched through 3 drawers before finding the correct knife for cutting pie, paused mid-sentence as if losing his train of thought before recovering with practiced smoothness. These weren't dramatic symptoms that announced themselves with unmistakable clarity, but rather the subtle erosions that could be easily dismissed as normal aging by someone who wanted to believe everything was fine. Sarah understood now why he'd been eating simple meals of bread and coffee. Complex meal preparation had probably become challenging on days when his cognitive function fluctuated. The realization that her strong, capable grandfather was struggling with something he couldn't fix through determination and hard work hit her like a physical blow. This man who'd taught her that any problem could be solved with enough effort and ingenuity was facing an enemy that didn't respond to traditional approaches. That evening, as they sat together by the fire, Sarah gently broached the subject of Joe's health, trying to find words that wouldn't sound accusatory or patronizing. The conversation required delicate navigation, acknowledging her concern without implying that he was incapable of managing his own affairs. "Grandpa, I was wondering if you might like some company for your next doctor's appointment," she began, watching his face for signs of defensiveness or embarrassment. His expression remained carefully neutral, but she saw his hands tighten slightly on the armrests of his chair, a tell she remembered from childhood when he was processing difficult information. "I know you're perfectly capable of handling things yourself, but I'd like to learn more about your health situation. Maybe ask some questions that might not occur to you in the moment." She held her breath, hoping her approach struck the right balance between respect for his autonomy and acknowledgement of her legitimate concerns. Joe studied her face for a long moment, and she could practically see him weighing the benefits of maintaining his privacy against the relief of sharing his burdens with someone who cared about the outcome. "I suppose that might be helpful," he said finally, his admission carrying the weight of a man surrendering a position he'd defended too long already. "Sometimes the medical folks talk pretty fast, use words I don't recognize, and by the time I think of questions to ask, they're already moving on to the next patient." Sarah felt relief flood through her chest, grateful that his practical nature had overcome his pride at least enough to accept her offer of support. She realized this conversation represented a fundamental shift in their relationship, the first time her grandfather had acknowledged needing help with something important, rather than simply tolerating her presence or accepting her assistance with minor tasks. "There's been some confusion lately," he continued, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. "Nothing too serious, just moments where I can't quite grab onto the word I want, or I'll start doing something and forget why I started." The vulnerability in his admission made Sarah's eyes burn with tears she refused to let fall, understanding that sharing these fears probably cost him more than she could comprehend. They talked late into the night about practical matters that neither of them had wanted to confront. Medical power of attorney, living wills, the possibility that Joe might eventually need more help than neighborly check-ins could provide. Sarah was surprised to discover that her grandfather had already completed most of the legal paperwork, working with a lawyer in the county seat to ensure his affairs were in order. "I've been getting my ducks in a row," he explained with characteristic understatement. "Seemed like the responsible thing to do, making sure I don't leave a mess for someone else to clean up." His matter-of-fact approach to planning for cognitive decline impressed and heartbroken Sarah simultaneously. Impressed by his foresight and practical wisdom, heartbroken by the evidence that he'd been contemplating these possibilities alone, without family support or input. "The house goes to you and Emma's children when they're old enough," he said, referencing the nephew and niece Sarah rarely saw despite living in the same state. "Figured you might want to keep it in the family. Maybe have somewhere to come when city life gets too overwhelming." The suggestion that she might someday want to return to Millerville permanently seemed impossible, but Sarah found herself nodding rather than dismissing the possibility outright. As they prepared for bed, Joe moved through his nighttime routine with the careful deliberation of someone who'd developed systems to compensate for occasional memory lapses. He checked the stove twice, tested the door locks, and arranged his medications for the following day with the precision of someone who'd learned that small oversights could have significant consequences. Sarah offered to help, but he waved her away with gentle stubbornness, clearly determined to maintain as much independence as possible for as long as possible. Watching him navigate his evening rituals made Sarah realize that aging with dignity required constant adaptation, constant problem-solving, constant courage in the face of increasing uncertainty. "Sleep well, honey," he called from his bedroom doorway, the same words he'd spoken to her countless times during childhood visits. But tonight they carried additional weight, a benediction from someone who understood that peaceful sleep was a gift that couldn't be taken for granted. Sarah lay awake for a long time afterward, listening to the familiar sounds of the old house settling around them and wondering how many more Christmas Eves she would have with the man who'd taught her what unconditional love looked like. The day after Christmas dawned gray and cold, with a kind of overcast sky that suggested more snow was coming. Sarah woke to find Joe already up and dressed, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the local newspaper spread before him, reading glasses perched on his nose as he studied the obituaries with the focused attention of someone whose peer group was steadily diminishing. She'd planned to catch a flight back to Chicago that afternoon, but the conversation with Mildred Henderson and her evening with Joe had shifted something fundamental in her priorities. The thought of returning to her empty apartment and demanding job while leaving her grandfather to navigate his challenges alone felt not just selfish but actively cruel. "I'm thinking about extending my stay," she announced as she poured herself coffee from the pot that had been keeping warm on the stove. Joe looked up from his paper with surprise and something that might have been relief, though he was too considerate to let his pleasure show too obviously. "You don't need to change your plans on my account," he said, but his tone suggested he hoped she would ignore his protests. Over breakfast, Sarah called her supervisor to request additional vacation time, explaining that a family situation required her extended presence. The conversation felt surreal, describing her grandfather's condition to a colleague who'd never met him, trying to quantify emotional necessity in terms that made sense to someone focused on quarterly reports and client deliverables. "Take the time you need," her boss said with a kind of brisk sympathy that acknowledged personal crises without wanting to hear details. "We can cover your accounts for a few more days." Sarah realized that her supposedly indispensable presence at the marketing firm was actually quite dispensable, that the professional urgency that had governed her life for years was largely manufactured rather than genuinely essential. The discovery that she could step away from her Chicago responsibilities without catastrophic consequences felt both liberating and slightly depressing, evidence that she'd been pouring her energy into work that mattered less than she'd convinced herself it did. "Thank you," she told her boss, already wondering if this extended leave might become something more permanent than either of them currently imagined. That morning they drove to Dr. Martinez's clinic in Joe's pickup truck, a 20-year-old Ford that had seen better decades but still ran reliably despite various rattles and cosmetic imperfections. The drive through the Missouri countryside reminded Sarah of all the trips they'd taken together when she was younger, visits to county fairs, shopping expeditions to buy school clothes, emergency runs to the feed store when something needed fixing on the farm. Joe drove carefully, his hands positioned precisely at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. His attention focused with the intensity of someone who understood that small mistakes could have serious consequences. Sarah noticed that he checked his mirrors more frequently than necessary and maintained a speed several miles below the posted limit, adaptations that suggested he'd already begun compensating for changes in his reflexes or judgment. The countryside rolled past them in shades of brown and white, dormant farmland resting under snow, waiting for spring to call it back to life. Barns and farmhouses dotted the landscape like punctuation marks in a story about persistence and adaptation, each one representing a family's attempt to build something lasting in a world that seemed increasingly focused on the temporary and disposable. Dr. Martinez turned out to be a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the sort of competent bedside manner that suggested genuine concern rather than professional obligation. She greeted Joe with familiar warmth, clearly someone who remembered her patients as individuals rather than case numbers, and welcomed Sarah with the understanding smile of someone who'd witnessed many family reunions prompted by health concerns. The examination room felt sterile compared to the warmth of the farmhouse, but Dr. Martinez's presence made it less intimidating, more like a conversation between friends than a medical interrogation. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm so glad you finally made it in," she said, settling into her chair with Joe's thick medical file spread before her. "And it's wonderful that your granddaughter could join us today." Sarah watched her grandfather's face carefully as Dr. Martinez began her gentle questioning, noting how he answered some queries with sharp clarity while others seemed to require more effort, as if he was reaching through fog to find the correct responses. The doctor's questions progressed from basic information, date, location, current president, to more complex inquiries about recent events and daily routines. Joe handled most of them well, but Sarah caught the slight hesitation before he answered what he'd eaten for breakfast, the way his eyes flickered briefly with uncertainty before settling on the correct response. "I want to run some cognitive tests," Dr. Martinez explained, her tone carefully neutral. "Nothing invasive, just some exercises to help us understand how your memory and thinking skills are functioning." Sarah held her breath as her grandfather worked through various tasks, drawing a clock face, remembering lists of words, following multi-step instructions. Some challenges he completed with ease, but others clearly frustrated him, and she could see the embarrassment building in his expression as certain tasks proved more difficult than they should have been. The silence in the room felt heavy during these moments, filled with the weight of a proud man confronting limitations he couldn't overcome through willpower alone. When the tests concluded, Dr. Martinez reviewed the results with compassionate honesty. "Mr. Mitchell, what we're seeing is consistent with mild cognitive impairment," she said gently. "It's more than normal aging, but not severe enough to significantly impact your daily life yet." The key word being yet. Sarah felt her chest tighten as the diagnosis she'd been dreading became official, even though part of her was relieved to finally have a name for the changes she'd observed. "There are medications that might help slow progression, and there are definitely lifestyle strategies that can make a difference," Dr. Martinez continued. "But the most important thing is making sure you have support systems in place, people who can help you navigate the challenges that may lie ahead." The drive home from the clinic passed in contemplative silence, both of them processing the weight of what they'd learned. Joe stared out at the familiar landscape with new awareness, perhaps seeing it through the lens of someone whose relationship with memory and recognition might become increasingly complicated. Sarah found herself memorizing details of the countryside they passed, suddenly precious in a way they'd never been before. The particular shade of red on that weathered barn, the precise curve of the creek that wound through the Henderson property, the way afternoon light fell across snow-covered fields with mathematical precision. "It's not a death sentence," she said finally, needing to break the silence that was becoming oppressive. "Dr. Martinez said some people live for years with mild impairment without it getting much worse. And some don't," Joe replied with characteristic honesty, his voice carrying acceptance rather than self-pity. "But that's true of everything, isn't it? None of us knows how much time we have or what challenges we'll face. The trick is making the most of whatever time you've got." His philosophical approach to the diagnosis impressed Sarah, though she suspected he'd had months to prepare for this moment while she was still catching up to reality. "I've been thinking about what the doctor said about support systems," he continued. "I know you have your own life in Chicago, your career and all. I don't want to be a burden, but I also don't want to pretend I can handle everything alone anymore." The admission cost him something, she could tell, but it also opened a door to conversations they needed to have about the future. That evening, Sarah sat at the old wooden desk in what had once been her father's study, surrounded by financial documents and medical papers that painted a clearer picture of Joe's situation. The numbers told a story of someone living carefully within limited means, stretching Social Security and a small pension to cover expenses that had been gradually increasing with age and health concerns. The sale of the farm to AgriCorp had provided some cushion, but most of that money had gone toward Grandma Rose's final medical expenses and Emma's treatments, leaving Joe with enough to maintain the house but little margin for unexpected costs or professional care services. As she reviewed the paperwork, Sarah began to understand the full scope of choices facing them. Joe could probably continue living independently for a while longer with some additional support. Someone to help with grocery shopping, medication management, transportation to medical appointments. But the progression Dr. Martinez had described would eventually require more intensive assistance, possibly including the kind of memory care facility that neither of them wanted to contemplate. The nearest quality facility was 60 miles away, which would mean severing Joe's connections to the community that had sustained him for 8 decades. "I've been thinking," Sarah said when Joe joined her in the study, carrying 2 cups of the chamomile tea Grandma Rose had always served before bed. "What if I stayed longer? Not just a few extra days, but really stayed. Moved back here for a while to help you navigate all this." The words surprised her even as she spoke them, but they felt right in a way that few decisions in her adult life had. Joe's eyebrows rose with surprise and something that looked like hope, though he was careful not to let his enthusiasm show too obviously. "That's a big change, honey," he said carefully. "Are you sure you've thought it through? Your job, your apartment, your whole life is up there in Chicago." Sarah realized she had been thinking it through, unconsciously, since the moment she'd seen him eating bread alone by the fire on Christmas Eve. Her life in Chicago, which had seemed so important and sophisticated from a distance, now felt hollow and temporary compared to the solid reality of family obligation and genuine need. "My job will survive without me," she said with growing conviction. "Probably better than I want to admit. And my apartment is just a place I sleep between workdays. But this," she gestured around the room filled with family history and toward the rest of the house where love had been cultivated for generations. "This is real. This matters in a way that marketing campaigns and client presentations never will." They talked late into the night about the practical aspects of such a dramatic change. Sarah would need to give notice at her job, arrange to sublet her Chicago apartment, figure out how to earn income in rural Missouri. The challenges seemed daunting when listed consecutively, but not insurmountable for someone with her education and experience. Remote work had become more common, and her marketing skills might translate to helping local businesses or nonprofits. The cost of living in Millerville was dramatically lower than Chicago, which meant her savings could stretch much further. "I could write," she said, surprising herself with the admission. "I used to love writing before I got caught up in the business world. Maybe this is a chance to remember who I was before I became so focused on who I thought I should be." Joe listened to her plans with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to distinguish between impulsive dreams and genuine commitments. "It won't be easy," he warned gently. "Small-town life can feel pretty quiet after the city, especially in winter. And watching someone you love deal with memory issues, that's its own kind of difficult. Are you sure you're ready for all that?" Sarah considered his question seriously, understanding that he was offering her an opportunity to reconsider without judgment or disappointment. But the more she thought about it, the more certain she became that this was the right choice, possibly the first genuinely right choice she'd made in years. "I'm ready," she said with conviction that surprised them both. "I want to be here, Grandpa. I want to help you stay in your home, in your community, for as long as possible. And honestly, I think I need this as much as you do." As they prepared for bed, Sarah felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. The decision to stay felt like coming home in the deepest sense, not just returning to a physical place, but reconnecting with values and priorities that had somehow gotten lost in her pursuit of professional success. She understood now that Emma's supposed visit hadn't been about supernatural communication, but about love's ability to call us back to what truly matters when we've wandered too far from our foundations. Outside her bedroom window, snow continued to fall on the farmland that had shaped her family for generations, and for the first time in years, Sarah felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The next few weeks passed in a blur of phone calls, paperwork, and practical arrangements as Sarah began the process of relocating her life from Chicago to Millerville. Her supervisor initially expressed surprise at her request for extended leave, but when Sarah explained that she was considering a permanent move to care for her grandfather, the conversation shifted to discussions about remote work possibilities and part-time consulting arrangements. The marketing firm, it turned out, had been considering expanding their rural market research anyway, and Sarah's first-hand experience in small-town dynamics could prove valuable for clients looking to reach those demographics. Packing her Chicago apartment proved to be an unexpectedly emotional experience. As she sorted through belongings accumulated over 5 years of city living, Sarah realized how much of her identity had been tied to objects that now seemed unnecessary or even burdensome. The expensive furniture that had impressed colleagues meant nothing in the context of a farmhouse filled with family antiques. The professional wardrobe that had been essential for her corporate image would be largely useless in rural Missouri. What mattered now were the books she'd collected but never had time to read, the photographs of family gatherings, the few handmade items that connected her to relationships rather than achievements. Her Chicago friends reacted to the news of her move with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. Some praised her dedication to family, while others questioned whether she was throwing away career opportunities that might never come again. "You can always find another grandfather," one colleague said with a kind of brutal honesty that passes for wisdom in corporate circles, "but you can't always find another promotion track like the one you're leaving." The comment stung, but it also clarified for Sarah how different her values had become from those of the people she'd thought were her peers. She realized that many of her urban relationships had been built around professional networking rather than genuine affection, connections that would probably fade once she was no longer useful for career advancement or social positioning. Meanwhile, Joe threw himself into preparing the farmhouse for permanent occupancy by 2 people rather than one lonely resident. Together, they cleaned out the spare bedroom that had served as storage space, transforming it into a proper office where Sarah could work remotely. They updated the house's internet service, installed better lighting in several rooms, and made small modifications to improve accessibility in case Joe's mobility became an issue in the future. The projects gave them shared purpose and plenty of opportunities for conversation, strengthening their relationship in ways that holiday visits had never allowed. Sarah discovered that her grandfather possessed a wealth of practical knowledge about everything from plumbing to electronics, skills that had been developed through decades of self-reliance on a working farm. As winter began to loosen its grip on the Missouri countryside, Sarah found herself settling into rhythms that felt both foreign and familiar. Mornings began early, often with coffee shared while watching sunrise paint the snow-covered fields in shades of pink and gold. Days were structured around Joe's medical appointments, household maintenance, and Sarah's remote work obligations, but they moved at a pace that allowed for conversation, reflection, and attention to details that urban life had trained her to ignore. Evenings frequently included visits from neighbors who'd gotten word of Sarah's return, people who remembered her as a child and were curious about the woman she'd become. These social calls reminded her of how community worked in small towns, not through scheduled appointments or formal invitations, but through the natural flow of people checking on each other and sharing the small dramas that made up daily existence. The hardest adjustment was learning to live with the uncertainty of Joe's condition, which manifested differently from day to day. Some mornings he woke sharp and energetic, ready to tackle projects or share stories with perfect clarity. Other days brought confusion that could be heartbreaking to witness. Moments when he couldn't remember where he'd put his glasses, conversations that circled back to the same topics repeatedly, instances when he seemed surprised to find Sarah in the house before remembering that she'd moved home to help him. Dr. Martinez had warned them that this inconsistency was normal for mild cognitive impairment, but knowing the medical explanation didn't make it easier to experience emotionally. Spring arrived in Millerville with the subtle drama of rural seasons. Gradual changes that accumulated into transformation, rather than sudden shifts that announced themselves boldly. Sarah found herself paying attention to details she'd forgotten during her city years. The precise day when maple buds began to swell, the evening when winter's harsh edge left the air for good, the morning when she heard the first meadowlark singing from fence posts along the gravel road. Joe's condition had stabilized somewhat, though Dr. Martinez cautioned that this plateau could be temporary. The medications seemed to be helping with some symptoms, and the structure of having Sarah present had reduced his anxiety about managing daily tasks alone. They established routines that worked for both of them, built around Joe's better times of day and Sarah's work schedule. Mornings were reserved for medical appointments, household tasks, and any activities that required sharp thinking. Afternoons often found them working together in the garden that Joe had maintained for decades, planning which vegetables to plant and where to expand the flower beds that had been Grandma Rose's special project. Sarah discovered she had inherited her grandmother's talent for growing things, and the physical work of preparing soil and planting seeds provided satisfaction that her marketing career had never delivered. Evenings were for reading, conversation, and the kind of quiet companionship that develops between people who've learned to appreciate each other's presence without constant entertainment. Sarah's remote work arrangement proved more successful than either she or her Chicago supervisor had expected. Her marketing insights, informed by daily life in rural Missouri, helped the firm develop campaigns that resonated with small-town consumers in ways their urban focus groups had missed. She found herself becoming the company's go-to expert on rural demographics, consulting on projects for agricultural equipment manufacturers, regional banks, and retail chains looking to expand into smaller markets. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd become more valuable to her employer by leaving the city than she'd ever been while working in their downtown office. The community of Millerville gradually embraced Sarah's return with the mixture of curiosity and acceptance that characterized small-town social dynamics. People remembered her as Joe Mitchell's granddaughter, Emma's sister, the girl who'd left for college and never come back, until now. Her decision to return home to care for her grandfather earned respect from neighbors who understood the challenges of aging and the value of family loyalty. She began to receive invitations to join community organizations, requests for help with local fundraising efforts, and informal consultations from small business owners who'd heard about her marketing expertise. Slowly, she was weaving herself back into the social fabric that had nurtured her during childhood. One evening in late April, as they sat on the front porch watching thunderclouds build on the western horizon, Joe shared memories of his own grandfather, who'd farmed this same land during the Depression. He used to say that every generation has to choose what they'll preserve and what they'll let go, Joe mused, his voice carrying the contemplative tone that had become more common as his condition progressed. The trick is knowing the difference between what's essential and what's just familiar. Sarah understood that he was talking about more than farming practices or family traditions. He was describing the choices they'd all made about how to spend their limited time and energy, what relationships to prioritize, what values to protect against the pressures of a changing world. As spring turned toward summer, Sarah realized she'd unconsciously begun thinking of Millerville as home rather than a temporary refuge. Her Chicago apartment had been sublet to someone who appreciated its urban conveniences, and her belongings looked natural in the farmhouse rooms where they'd found permanent places. The decision that had initially seemed like a sacrifice, giving up career advancement to care for an aging relative, had revealed itself as a gift she'd given herself. The chance to remember who she was beneath the professional identity she'd constructed, the opportunity to experience love as something you do rather than something you feel. She was happier than she'd been in years, despite the challenges of watching someone she loved navigate cognitive decline. By Christmas of the following year, the farmhouse had been transformed into something neither Sarah nor Joe could have imagined 12 months earlier. The rooms buzzed with activity as extended family gathered for the first large holiday celebration the house had seen since Emma's final Christmas. Sarah's cousins had driven from Kansas City with their children, bringing noise and energy that made the old walls seem to expand with joy. The kitchen counter groaned under the weight of dishes contributed by neighbors who remembered what Mitchell family Christmases used to look like and wanted to help recreate that magic for a new generation. Joe moved through the festivities with careful dignity, His condition stable enough that most visitors wouldn't notice anything amiss unless they knew what to look for. He tired more easily than before and sometimes needed gentle reminders about names or recent events, but his essential warmth and humor remained intact. Watching him interact with his great-nieces and great-nephews, Sarah realized that some forms of love transcend cognitive function. The instinctive affection between grandparents and children operates at levels deeper than memory or recognition. The children responded to his gentleness with the easy acceptance that comes naturally to those too young to fear aging or imperfection. Sarah had spent weeks preparing for this gathering, but not in the frantic way she once approached professional presentations or social obligations. Instead, the preparations felt like acts of devotion, polishing silver that had belonged to her great-grandmother, hanging Christmas stockings embroidered with names spanning 4 generations, arranging photographs that told the story of a family that had learned to love deeply despite loss and separation. She'd invited the Hendersons, Dr. Martinez, and several other community members who'd become part of their extended support system, understanding that family was both biological and chosen, both inherited and created through conscious acts of care. The Christmas Eve dinner that year was everything Sarah remembered from childhood and more. Abundant food, multi-generational conversation, the kind of laughter that comes from people who know each other's stories and choose to celebrate rather than judge. Joe sat at the head of the table with the contentment of someone who'd lived to see his investment in family relationships pay dividends he couldn't have anticipated. When he stood to offer the blessing, a tradition he'd maintained for 60 years, his voice carried the authority of someone who'd learned to distinguish between what mattered and what merely seemed important. "We gather tonight grateful for the gift of each other," he said, his eyes finding Sarah's across the table. "For love that calls us home when we've wandered too far, for second chances to get relationships right, for the grace that lets us find our way back to what we should never have left behind." After dinner, as the younger children played with new toys and the adults settled into comfortable conversation, Sarah found herself standing in the doorway between the kitchen and living room, surveying the scene with wonder. A year ago, she'd been climbing these porch steps in expensive boots, worried about the career implications of a brief family visit. Now she was home in the deepest sense, surrounded by people who knew her history and cared about her future, committed to work that felt meaningful rather than merely profitable. Joe caught her eye from his recliner and smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd witnessed a minor miracle. A granddaughter who'd remembered how to come home, a family that had learned to gather around love rather than obligation, a house that had found its purpose again after years of quiet waiting. As the evening wound down and relatives began the process of departure and overnight arrangements, Sarah helped Joe with his bedtime routine, now familiar after months of gentle assistance. They moved through the tasks with practiced efficiency. Medications sorted, doors checked, tomorrow's clothes laid out in case morning brought confusion about seasonal or social appropriateness. "Thank you," he said as she helped him settle into bed, the same room where he'd slept beside Grandma Rose for 47 years. "Not just for tonight but for everything. For coming home, for staying, for choosing us over all those other things you could have chosen." Sarah kissed his forehead the way he'd kissed hers during childhood bedtimes, understanding that gratitude flowed both directions. She was as grateful to him for giving her a reason to remember what love looked like when it was lived rather than merely felt. That night, Sarah lay in her childhood bedroom listening to the familiar sounds of the old house settling around its sleeping occupants, but the silence felt full rather than empty, pregnant with possibility rather than heavy with loneliness. Outside her window, snow was beginning to fall again, covering the farmland in the same pristine white that had welcomed her home exactly 1 year ago. But everything had changed. Not just the circumstances of their lives, but their understanding of what made life worth living. She'd learned that coming home wasn't about returning to childhood, but about choosing to honor the relationships and values that had shaped her before the world convinced her they were insufficient for adult happiness. Sometimes the most radical thing you could do was remember who you were before you became who you thought you should be. And sometimes love was less about grand gestures than about showing up consistently for the small moments that accumulated into a meaningful life. In the morning, there would be breakfast to prepare, medications to sort, Christmas presents to open with the grandchildren who would fill the house with energy and purpose. There would be phone calls to make, appointments to schedule, work projects to complete from the desk in what had once been her father's study. There would be good days and difficult days, progress and setbacks, laughter and tears as they navigated the uncertain path ahead. But tonight, surrounded by family and community, Sarah understood that she'd made the right choice. Not just for Joe's sake, but for her own. She'd come home for Christmas and discovered that home wasn't a place you left behind, but a set of relationships you carried with you and returned to when wisdom finally taught you what truly mattered. The granddaughter who'd worried about visiting an elderly relative had become a woman who understood that love was the only investment that guaranteed meaningful returns, the only work that mattered at the end of all our striving and achieving and trying to become someone important enough to deserve happiness.